You don't already have a handout or some in the back on the podium there. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground today. I hope you've had a chance to read through at least about chapter 21, because we're going to have to kind of skim over some things in there as we try to focus on Abraham and his family and following the lineage of that seed promise as we've been doing. So there are some things we'll just kind of have to briefly summarize as we go along. We're going to focus on Ishmael and the promise of Isaac and their births here this morning. Before we do that, let's have a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for another beautiful day. We're especially grateful for your word, how you've revealed yourself to us so that we could know you and love you. And we are grateful for this time that we have to open up your word, and pray that you will make it jump out at us, to help us to learn from it, to see the application that you want us to see as we continue through our study of the book of Genesis. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. So we briefly touched on chapter 15 at the end of class last week. I wanted to just say a couple of things about chapter 15 before we move on to chapter 16. So in chapter 15, in the beginning, God speaks to Abraham in a vision and tells him, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." And I love that phrase, I am a shield to you. That should have been very comforting to Abraham. We see that phrase used by David in the Psalms, I think. But this idea of protection would have been comforting to Abraham. And in Abraham, in his response, I think we kind of see why God would say that to Abram, why God would be coming to him again to comfort him and reassure him, because we see Abraham asking God, how is he going to carry out these promises? And he points out that the only heir that he has is one of his servants, Eliezer. And it's probably that Lot would have been seen as his heir, but Lot has gone his separate way, and we'll come back to him in a little while. But he still doesn't have a son. And there's two ways I think we can look at that. One is that this is maybe showing some doubt or lack of faith on Abraham's part, and some time has passed, and all these promises depend on him having children, and he still doesn't. I don't know that it really shows a lack of faith, but I do think it shows us that Abraham's not just following God blindly and never thinking about or questioning the things that God is going to do and what the future holds. And in reality, I think that this actually kind of shows Abraham's faith. He knows that God is going to carry out his promises, but he still is wondering, well, how are you going to do it, God? How are you going to do that given my current state? And because if Abraham doesn't have faith in God's promises, he's not going to be wondering how God is going to bring them about. And so although we might look at this and see that Abraham is doubtful, I think of it kind of like Job. Think about Job and how he has all these frank conversations with God during his suffering in that book. And he questions God pretty seriously. But yet we're told over and over again that Job did not sin. So it's not sinful to wonder about why things are the way that they are and what God is going to do and what he has planned. And so knowing that Abraham is grappling with these things and these ideas in chapter 15, God is reassuring Abraham. And so he goes even further in chapter 15 than he has before. He makes it clear that his heir is going to be a son of his own. So he's going to have a son of his own. And verse 6 says, "Then he believed in the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness." God points Abraham to the stars and tells him, not only are you going to have a son, but your descendants are going to be like these stars. They're going to be innumerable. Um, God is going to go as far as to tell him things that are going to happen in the lives of his descendants. So he actually tells Abraham about basically the events of the story of Exodus there in chapter 15. So let's move on to chapter 16 and look at the story of Hagar and the birth of Ishmael. So in verse 1 in chapter 16, it says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him a child, but she had an Egyptian slave whose woman was an Egyptian slave woman whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, See now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please have relations with my slave woman. Perhaps I will obtain children from her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so after Abram lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave woman, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Then he had relations with Hagar, and she conceived. And when Hagar became aware that she had conceived, her mistress was insignificant in her sight. So Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be upon you. I put my slave woman into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was insignificant in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Look, your slave woman is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. And so Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. So God, again, has promised to Abraham multiple times, multiple occasions, that he's going to have all of these descendants. But as time has gone on, we're not making any progress in Abraham and Sarah's mind to that end. And so, even though God has told Abraham, as we talked about in chapter 15, that he's going to have a son, he's going to have a child, and all these other promises, we start to see some real doubt and some issues come about. How much time has passed since chapter 12 and those promises are first revealed to Abraham? Did you catch that? Yeah, it's been at least 10 years, because we're told in verse 3 that Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. And then later on, at the end of chapter 16, we're told that when Ishmael is born, Abraham's 86, and he was 75 there in chapter 12. So it seems like a little over 10 years have passed since he settled in Canaan and God first gave these promises to him. So given that amount of time, what do you think might have been going on in Abraham and Sarah's mind? Yeah, I think I think they probably struggled with this the first time God told them, but now it's been 10 years. A lot has happened, and still God's not done anything in their minds to bring this about. Right? And what tends to happen when we wait a long time for something we're eagerly anticipating? Yeah, we may give up, get negative, can kind of shape our whole outlook on things. I think, this is not a unique problem in the Bible, not being able to have children. We see that over and over again, and it's not a unique problem in life today. And people that are going through that, struggling through that, it can affect everything they do and everything they think. And so you can imagine the things that are going through their mind. But I'm not sure that they've really given up on the promises of God. I don't think that should be our takeaway from this story. I think we see them trying to take matters into their own hands and not being willing to wait on God in this story. So Sarah comes to Abraham with the idea that they have a child through her slave Hagar. She sees that God has prevented her from having children, so she wants him to have a child through her. And we're told that she's an Egyptian, so it's very possible, very likely that she went into their service during their time in Egypt that we read about in chapter 12. And so Abraham listens to Sarah. Their plan works from their perspective. Hagar conceives. But there's a lot of, I think, problems going on here. So I'm going to tell you what I see here. But let me ask you first: what issues do you see with all of this? I think there's a lot of layers to this. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think certainly. Makes me think of is it uh, Second Peter 3? I forget where in one of Peter's letters that 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. God operates differently than us. So for Abraham and Sarah, this is a very long time, especially when they're waiting on something anxiously. But for God, He sees things differently. He has His plan that He's going to unfold. Yes, ma'am. I, I think that is a little down the road, but we are going to kind of talk about that. I'm going to be very careful not to wade into too much, geopolitical discussion. But I think that is one of the clear ramifications of this. Uh, okay. Yeah. Well, good. I didn't know y'all were doing that on Thursday until somebody mentioned this past week. So I'm sorry if you're getting a double dose, but hopefully it'll really stick after getting it back to back. Yes, ma'am. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's I agree. I think it's easy for us to look at this in the context of our culture and how we see things and be kind of shocked that I mean, if this were to come about, I would have been less surprised if it was Abraham that brought it up than Sarah, don't you think? So we'll talk in a second about kind of the cultural reasons why maybe this shouldn't surprise us as much. Yes, ma'am. Mhm. Yes, you're exactly right. There's a lot of parallels here in terms of how this kind of starts with an idea in Sarah's mind, and she presents temptation for Abraham just as Eve presented temptation for Adam. And so there's certainly a lot there. Anything else we see? Yes, sir. So I think she's trying to help God's plan. I think it's the next chapter in chapter 17 and 18 that Sarah is specifically promised to have a child. So I don't think Sarah specifically, and there's something we've been told about where Sarah is specifically um, told that she's going to have a child. So that's a good point. I think this is another example where we talked about with what happened in Egypt, where they have good intentions. I think they're trying to aid in their own imperfect way God in carrying out His promises. They don't see in their minds that God's doing anything, so they're going to try to take action. Um, we've all heard the thought that God helps those who help themselves. Anybody know where that is in the Bible? It's actually not in the Bible. It sounds like it should be, but it's not. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but oftentimes when we try to take matters into our own hands, especially when the way that we go about that is contrary to God's will and what God has set forth in terms of the pattern for us, things tend to go haywire, and that's certainly what we see here. But let me give you a couple of things observations I see here in the story. One, it shows a lack of patience. As we talked about, 10 years or more have passed, and certainly the fulfillment of these promises to their fullest extent is not going to happen in their lifetime. But the first step towards those promises has to happen in their lifetime. And so you can imagine as time is going on, anticipation is building. And though both Abraham are great men and women of faith, as we read about in chapter 11, we see a struggle, a failure in terms of a lack of patience. And I think it's often in these situations where we fall into sin, isn't it? Where we've been perhaps doing really well for a long time. We've been holding fast to the promises of God. We've been living the way we ought to live. But over time, when we don't feel like we're seeing the fruits of our labor, so to speak, we get weary. And we're in a moment of weakness. And that's often when the devil, I think, tries to cash in. We also see disregard for the sanctity of marriage. Again, I don't think we should read this and just be totally disgusted and shocked by what happens here, because there's some cultural context. Especially in that day and age, having children was very important. It was important for passing down your lineage, for passing down your inheritance. It was especially going to be important for Abraham and Sarah, knowing these promises that they had. We see a similar situation later on with Jacob and Rachel. And so it very likely was kind of a custom in the society and culture in that day and age to do something like this. It's almost kind of like a surrogacy situation, although not in the way it would be done nowadays. And so I do think Abraham and Sarah, again, have good intentions in doing this. I think they're trying to bring about God's promise, perhaps not knowing yet that God has specifically planned for Sarah to have a child. But clearly this goes against God's pattern and plan for marriage. That's set forth in the very beginning. Genesis chapter 2, in verse 24, it says, "A man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And so that one flesh that's formed between Abraham and Sarah has been disrupted. And what we see, as we talked about, is all of the jealousy and the problems that are caused by this. We see a lot of instances of the sanctity of marriage not being upheld in the Bible, even among people of faith like Abraham, David, Solomon, all these different instances. And in each case, I think we're shown that when you mess this up, when you go outside of God's plan, things don't go well. And so, as much as we might expect it to be Sarah who's jealous in the situation and who's going to have all these bad feelings, at first it's Hagar, interestingly, who we're told after she conceives, she starts to think little of Sarah. It seems like kind of a pride over, I'm able to conceive, God has looked at me favorably and not you. But all kinds of problems are caused. And ultimately, it's not just, petty conflict between two women that happens. It's going to cause conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, and it's going to cause conflict between Ishmael and Isaac's descendants that you could say we're still dealing with today. So lots of problems come from that. We also see that they're just thinking they can figure things out on their own. They think they have a solution to their problem, but God still has a plan, still has a purpose that he's going to carry out, and they decide to take matters into their own hands. And I think we see that in our own lives. We often try to do things our own way, and how does that usually go for us? It oftentimes doesn't go very well. And I think it kind of goes two ways. Sometimes Oftentimes we try to do things our own way and we fail miserably, right? But oftentimes we succeed in trying to do what we want to do, but we, I think, succeed miserably as well. Here, they succeeded. They accomplished what they set out to do. In their minds, they've helped move forward these promises by creating a son through Hagar, and yet the outcome is not what they thought it would be. And I think that's often what happens when we try to do things our own. That proverb, God helps those who helps themselves, that's just of human origin. Let me give you some real proverbs. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way which seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death. Proverbs 3 verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. So Abraham, I think, does that by and large throughout his life. But here we see him trying to carve his own path, he and Sarah. And instead of his paths being made right, as they would have been if he'd followed the Lord, they create some issues for themselves. And then last thing I want to point out here is that Abraham failed to lead his family and follow God above all. A key verse there is verse 2, that in verse 2, Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. And so as we talked about, I see a lot of parallels here between the story of Adam and Eve and the story here. Abraham had all these promises in his mind. He's been listening to God's voice by and large, but here he listens to the voice of his wife instead. And if you remember back to Genesis 3, when God is pronouncing all these judgments against Adam and Eve, what's specifically said to Adam is that this is because you listened to the voice of Eve. And here this is because Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. So it's not that he doesn't have any responsibility in this. He's certainly accountable for his actions, but it starts with, I think, failing to lead his family, lead his wife as he should have, and following her voice instead of following the Lord's voice above all. Is it a good idea to listen to your wife most times, guys? Yes, but if what she is telling you to do doesn't exactly fall in line with what God would have you to do, then you need to listen to God and not your wife. But that's often, I think, what gets us in trouble, listening to the voice of others around us and following their influence instead of God's. So we see the fallout after this happens. Hagar ends up going on the run due to this conflict between her and Sarah. And so that brings us to verse 7, when something very interesting happened. We read that the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. No one's exactly sure where this is, but it seems to have been kind of in between Canaan and Egypt, so very possible she was fleeing back home to the only other place she would have known, I think. But the angel of the Lord appears to her and tells her several things. First, he tells her that she needs to go back. She needs to go back, and she needs to submit herself to Sarah. And that reminds me a little bit of, if you read the letter of Philemon, how God had told Onesimus to go back to his master, Philemon. And so she's got to go back and fulfill her responsibilities to her mistress. And I think there's maybe a little bit of a lesson there. And you know, how do we rebuild a broken situation? Well, we need to be willing to go back and do what we need to do. You know, he doesn't tell her, wait until, you know, Sarah's got her mind right and then go back. He says, no, you go back and you fulfill your responsibilities. Be the one to start this. She's told that she'll be blessed. She's going to have a son. She's conceived because God has heard her affliction. Right? There's a couple of interesting details here that God has heard her, and as Hagar reflects towards the end, that God has seen her. And so she's going to have a son, and God's going to multiply his descendants, her descendants. And so part of God's promise to make the descendants of Abraham like the stars in the sky is going to be fulfilled through Ishmael, through this son, through Hagar, but we're told specifically about Ishmael. His name means God's hears. As we're told, God had heard her affliction. He's going to be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and vice versa. And he will live in defiance of all of his brothers. And so we're told, I think, that there's going to be a lot of ramifications to what has been done. There's going to be the son. There's going to be conflict between one branch of Abraham's descendants and another branch between Isaac and Ishmael and their descendants. There's going to be long-term ramifications that, again, we're really seeing even today. A couple of observations, and then we'll move on, that I think are pretty interesting. One, this is the first time that we read about the angel of the Lord appearing. I think the angel of the Lord appears in the Old Testament about 58 times, and then the angel of God is mentioned 11 times. And the first time it's to Hagar, this Egyptian slave woman who's on the run, who's been a party to this messed up situation, the sinful plan of Abraham and Sarah, and yet God hears her affliction. In verse 13, Hagar says, "You are a God who sees me." This is also the first time, I think, that a birth is specifically announced, and we're told who it's going to be, what the name is going to be, and there's certainly other times where that's going to happen in the Bible as well. And I can't help but think that a little bit of this is demonstrating the character of God that is really seen throughout the Bible, but I think also seen especially through Jesus. I think it's easy for us to think that God only cares about and is fixated on Abraham's descendants and the people of Israel, but that's never really been the case. We see that God even cares for Hagar and sees her, as she put it. And it just kind of reminds me of Jesus and how when he comes, he isn't just focused on the people that are in the palaces and in the high places. Who does he come to? Who does he spend his time with? Sinners, tax collectors, the outcasts, the sick, the needy. He pays special attention to them because his purpose ultimately was to seek and save the lost. And so I think we see a little bit of a glimpse of that same nature here in how God treats Hagar. Yes, ma'am.
One of the mind-blowing things I ever heard from was that possibly angel of the Lord, angel of God, was the Spirit of Christ. We can't only know 33 years between the skin and bone. And I know Gabriel and Mary, but so many times that angel of the Lord, that angel of God, the very long Spirit of Christ doing the work. And it just, I'm not saying that's good.
Yeah.
Every time I heard it, it was just wonderful that it just made it all so good.
That is one interpretation of this, that the angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnate version of the Messiah, that it's the Logos, the Word. So it's possible. I don't think we can definitely know that. So it's possible. I wouldn't dispute that one way or another very heavily. But yeah, that's one possible explanation that people think. So then we're told Ishmael's born when Abraham is 86, and so we have Abraham's first son. All right, let's look at chapter 17. So chapter 17, another chunk of time passes, and God appears to Abraham again in verse 1 when he was 99 years old. All right, so 13 years have passed since chapter 16 where we just left off. And in this, God is reaffirming the promises to make Abraham a father of multitudes and says that he's going to make a covenant with Abraham. And here's where that name change happens. So far it's been Abram, which means exalted father. And can you imagine if your name is exalted father and you're, up until 86, you have no children? All right. Now his name's going to be Abraham, which is father of a multitude. And still that might have been a point of embarrassment or cause people to kind of, wait, father of a multitude and you just have one children? But that shows God is continuing to work out this promise. Sarai is also going to be called Sarah now, and both of those names mean princess. It's just different dialects. And so God tells Abraham in this chapter that he's going to establish his covenant with Abraham and his descendants. That the land where Abraham has been living as a stranger so far is going to be given as an everlasting possession for his descendants. Kings are going to come from his descendants, and God is going to be a God to Abraham, and God will be a God to his descendants. There's going to be this special relationship between God and the descendants of Abraham. And so God is going to give a sign of this covenant, and it is the sign of circumcision. And so as part of this covenant, every male in Abraham's household and from his descendants are to be circumcised. And so every male who is born, every slave who's either born into his house or is bought, and anyone who is not circumcised is to be cut off for breaking this covenant going forward. And so this is going to be a sign of God's covenant with the descendants of Abraham. And I don't think it's supposed to be a sign to everyone else because they're going to be wearing clothes, and so it's not going to be obvious just from looking at someone that they have been circumcised. I think it's more going to be a sign to themselves, a reminder to themselves of this covenant that they have with God. And so if we jump ahead towards the end of chapter 17, then we'll come back to the things that are said in between. Abraham immediately obeyed. We see another demonstration of Abraham's faith, that God asked something pretty serious, I would say, of Abraham, and he immediately obeys. And so he's circumcised himself at 99, but then all of the men in his household are circumcised, including Ishmael, who's 13. I can't imagine that was a very fun conversation to have, but we're told that it took place. And so the focus I want to come back to, though, is what is said in verses 15 through 22. So here's where God addresses Sarah. In verse 15, he says, "Then God said to Abraham, for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her by the name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." And then the response from Abraham is very interesting. Verse 17, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth to a child?" And so it's a very interesting reaction here. It's actually the second time in chapter 17 that we're told Abraham fell on his face. Verse 3, it says, "Abraham fell on his face, and God talked to him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you." I think that first instance is clearly Abraham falling on his face and worshiping in reverence and awe of God who's appearing to him again. But then in verse 17, he falls on his face and laughs. What do you make of that reaction? What do you think of that? Yes.
Shock, because that's the reaction I have.
Yeah.
I don't respond necessarily, but it's just like
Yeah. I don't necessarily think Abraham thought God was joking. I think there's kind of two ways we can maybe interpret it. One is that he is kind of laughing at how far-fetched this sounds, and it does sound far-fetched. It does sound crazy. Or it could just be that he's, again, falling down with reverence, but he's laughing for joy and a mix of shock and, that God still is going to bring about this promise, that God is still going to give him a child through Sarah. But again, I don't think we should take this as a sign of Abraham doubting God or losing, not believing God. Again, there's nothing wrong with struggling to grasp the powerful, wonderful things that God is able to do and is going to do, and that's what Abraham is trying to do that. And I think the fact that Abraham immediately goes and circumcises himself and all of his household should show us that after God says these things to him, his faith is, if anything, it has been strengthened by all of this. But interesting, Abraham is thinking, though, when God says this to him, he's thinking of Ishmael. He says in verse 18, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Abraham, is like, well, what about the son I already have? What's going to be done about him? Yes, great that Sarah is going to have a child, but what about Ishmael? And so it's understandable that he would ask about this, but God affirms that Sarah's going to have a son. His name is going to be Isaac, which means he laughs, which I think has to do with the fact that Abraham laughs and Sarah laughs in the next chapter. So God makes it clear, Isaac, your son with Sarah, is going to be the son of promise. That's the one who is going to be a part of this covenant that we're making. But I'm not going to forget about Ishmael. He's not just going to be left out in the wind. He too is going to be blessed. He's going to be a father of multitudes as well. Any thoughts about that? I know we're moving through kind of quickly, but I want to try to get through the next section as well. All right. So chapter 18 seems, although we had a gap between 16 and 17, chapter 18 seems to pick up right where chapter 17 leaves off, because we know that based on the timeline and the details about when these things are going to happen, we know that not much time has passed. In chapter 18, the Lord appears to Abraham again in the form of three men. So verse 1 tells us that the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. I think that kind of summarizes this whole encounter, because then in verse 2, he sees three men standing opposite him. And as we read through this account, and as we read into chapter 19, I think it becomes clear that two of the men were angels who were going to go on to Sodom, and that the other one that appeared is the Lord appearing in some form that Abraham is able to see. What's not abundantly clear if you read through chapter 18 is at what point Abraham knows that the Lord is speaking to him. We see God, Abraham interacting with them, and at a point it becomes clear that Abraham's speaking with God, but we're not totally sure at what point Abraham knew. So you may notice in verse 3 where it says, "My Lord," when Abraham's speaking. Some translations capitalize Lord, and some it may be lowercase, because even translators are kind of divided on whether when Abraham says that he's addressing God knowingly, or that he's just saying "my Lord," as we might say to someone you're showing deference to. So the men appear. Abraham and Sarah show hospitality toward them, and while they eat, they ask Abraham where his wife was, and we're told that she's in the tent, she's listening in. And God says to Abraham that next year he's going to return and Sarah will have a son. And we're reminded again that, Abraham is old, Sarah is old, she's past the childbearing age. And Sarah gives a similar reaction in verse 12. "So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, 'After I become old, am I to have pleasure, my Lord being old also?'" And so Sarah has kind of a similar reaction to what we saw from Abraham. And what it could mean is that maybe Abraham had not told Sarah yet what God told him in chapter 17, or it could just be that Sarah was told, but she's still kind of struggling with this. She's not as confident as Abraham might have been, and so she's still kind of, astounded by this. And she actually denies laughing when the Lord calls her out on it. She denies it because she's afraid and says, "No, I did laugh." And God said, "No, but you did laugh." So there's just this interesting interaction there. So, this is kind of an interesting encounter. Maybe it's just, God again appearing in a different way to reassure them that this is going to happen. Get ready for it. Maybe Abraham was certain after chapter 17, but Sarah was not. And so this happens to give her confidence in what's going to take place. But it's just an interesting encounter there. So then as chapter 18 goes on, in verse 16, we read that the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. And then in the next few verses, we have an interesting, almost kind of like an internal monologue from God, where he's discussing whether he should tell Abraham what he's going to do to Sodom. And I don't think it's like God really struggling with what to do. I think it's really more just God explaining to us why he's telling Abraham what he's going to do. And so ultimately we learn as we read on that the two angels keep going on. In chapter 19, we read about them coming to meet Lot, who is embedded himself in the city unwisely. And so God begins to have this discussion in the latter part of chapter 18 about what's going to happen. And so he tells Abraham in verse 20, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now to see whether they have done entirely as the outcry which has come to me indicates, and if not, I will know. And so Abraham understands that God is about to do something great. He's about to judge these cities. And so we have this, I think, fascinating conversation between the two of them where, Abraham says, surely you're not going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked. And, what if there's 50 people? Are you not going to save the city on the count of 50 people? And God says he will. And Abraham negotiates them almost all the way down to 10 people. So God says if there's 10 righteous people, he won't destroy the city for their sake. But I think it's just interesting to see that back and forth between Abraham and God, and Abraham kind of speaking boldly with God. I mean, it reminds me again, we read about Moses talking with God face to face as a man would talk to a friend. I kind of think we see a little bit of that here in a similar relationship between Abraham and God. So in chapter 19, we read about Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. I'm going to give that to you to read for homework if you haven't already. I think the story kind of speaks for itself. The Lot has again embedded himself in the city, and they're destroyed. But Lot and his family are going to be spared. Ultimately, it's only he and his daughters that make it out alive. And it's indicated to us that really this happens because of his relationship with Abraham. God spares them on Abraham's account. And then in the latter part of chapter 19, we read this story about Lot and his daughters, and we really see the corruption that has taken place in their family, I think largely because of the influence of being around all of the wickedness that they've been in. Interestingly, Lot is now living in a cave, kind of, on almost like a fugitive. And so how far has he come from choosing the best part of the land, moving towards the big city, and now, as a result of all that, he finds himself with a family that's broken, and he's living in caves. One detail that's given there is that Lot is going to have a lot of descendants as well as a result of all this. The Ammonites and the Moabites will come from him. We'll get into we'll talk about chapter 21 kind of briefly next week. I want to really focus on chapter 22 and all that's revealed to us there. That's going to be very important and connects obviously very heavily to the gospel story. So make sure you read that. But we'll try to kind of summarize the latter days of Abraham and get into the life of Isaac and all of that next week. We won't really cover chapter 20. Chapter 20, if you read it, is very similar to chapter 12 and what happens in Egypt. So I think a lot of the takeaway from there is going to be very similar. So it'd be good for you to read that, but we're going to turn our focus to the birth of Isaac and the events that follow next week. So read at least through, I would say, chapter probably 26. 26 or so. Yeah. All right. Have a good week.